The tubular bind-off is a sewn bind-off that mimics the tubular cast-on to make matching edges on 1x1 ribbing. It can take some practice to memorize, but once you get a feel for the rhythm of it, it doesn't take long at all to do a long edge, but we're just going to do a little swatch here. All you need is your project with the working yarn still attached. I've joined a contrast color using the Russian join so you can see what I'm doing, but typically you will just be using your working yarn. And you need a yarn needle that's not too sharp so you don't split stitches, and a pair of snips. To begin, cut a tail from your working yarn that is approximately 3 times the length of the section you're binding off. It uses a little less than 3 times, so doing this will make sure you have enough yarn to work with. All right, the first step is to set us up. The first stitch is a knit stitch, so that dictates how we begin. It's going to be our setup stitch, so it gets worked a little differently than everything else. So we're just going to insert the needle knitwise, pull it through, and drop it off. Our next stitch is a purl stitch, and it begins a sequence that's worked over 4 stitches, and I find it helpful to think of it as 2 sets of 2. So we're going to work 2 purlwise and then 2 knitwise over 4 stitches. So my next stitch is a purl stitch, so that means I'm going to be working purlwise. We're going to actually skip this first stitch for the moment and insert the needle purlwise into the second stitch on the left-hand needle. And then we are going to insert this yarn needle purlwise into the first stitch and drop that one off the needle. Now we've got a knit stitch leading, so we're going to work our knitwise actions, and here's where it gets a little weird. You're going to, from the back, bring your yarn needle around and insert it in between the first and second stitch on the left needle. We're just passing it over. Now we're going to insert it knitwise through this second stitch, but we're going to pass it all the way back to the wrong side again. That creates a little twist that's necessary for this bind off. And now we're going to insert knitwise into the first stitch from the front, so the yarn is getting brought around in a little bit of a twisted loop. Pull it through and drop that knit stitch off. And that ends our 2 sets of 2. So we're just going to repeat that again. We're going to insert the yarn needle purlwise into the second stitch on the left-hand needle. And then we're going to insert it purlwise into the first stitch on the left-hand needle. Make sure you don't capture anything you don't want. And pull it through. Now we're going to work our knitwise pair by passing from the back the yarn needle in between 2 stitches. Then we're going to insert it knitwise through the second stitch, but out through the back. And then we're going to insert it knitwise through the first stitch and drop that first stitch off the needle. As you get further along, the corner will stop getting in your way. And another purlwise set. This is the most complicated part, is coming from the back in between 2 stitches without going through 2 stitches, and then working knitwise through to the back. And it looks pretty strange when you're working it with a contrast color, but when you work it in your main color, it'll be almost invisible. So that's the basic set of pairs. And then the real trick is just remembering where you are and continuing to work. The trick that I find most useful to keep track of where you work is you're going to look at the first stitch on your left needle and see if it has 1 strand of yarn sewn through it or 2 strands of yarn sewn through it. If there are 2 strands of yarn, it means you need to drop that stitch off the needle and look at the next stitch. But if it has 1 strand of yarn going through it, that's the one that indicates what you'll be doing next. So I have a purl stitch here with 1 strand of yarn, which means I've got a purl pair next. So I'm going to work purlwise through the second stitch, purlwise through the first stitch, drop it off, and then I've got a knit stitch leading with 1 yarn strand sewn into it. So I'm going to work a knitwise pair by inserting in between the 2 stitches from the back, stitch through, stitch through from front to back knitwise on the second stitch, and stitch through knitwise from the front into the first stitch. And having the first stitch act as your guide will help you if you need to set your knitting down when you are partially through it. And you just keep stitching like this, making sure each stitch gets worked into twice. And you repeat these 2 pairs of 2. When you reach your final pair of stitches, you're just going to start working them as normal and drop off that first stitch. And that leaves you with 1 stitch left on your needles. It's a purl stitch for me, so I'm just going to sew into it purlwise. And if it was a knitwise stitch, I would sew into it knitwise and drop it off. And that's it. That's our tubular bind off edge. When you're done, just weave in all of your ends. It will be secure enough like that, and it will be much stretchier than a lot of other bind off treatments.